From PSG to Eintracht Frankfurt, it's not that huge a leap given the season that the Eintracht Frankfurt ended in the Bundesliga and coming third. However, the question is, how do they go to the next level? Clearly, if they're going to challenge the big gun in the Bundesliga, Andy, they've got to circumvent or bypass at least a couple of other challengers to the title of main challenger, I'd have thought.
Yeah, I guess the interesting thing about Eintracht Frankfurt is they won't be, at least outwardly, saying that we are seeking to challenge Bayern as our next step. They won't be looking at that at all. But after 2 Champions League qualifications in 3 seasons and getting this one through the Bundesliga, which is a huge step, I guess you have to ask, A, with the way that Bayern have strengthened in the last year, and B, the way that some of the challengers have fallen short, particularly last year, is there an opportunity for them? And I think there is an opportunity for them. Look, their aim will be to establish themselves in the top 4, which I think is doable. And that's the first step for them. If it ends up being something more, I think that's a question maybe we can answer when we look at what they're doing well and what they've done well for a number of years. Now, of course, what they've done well for a number of years primarily is developed players and sold them. So, look, we could go through all of them, and you think from Jovic, Rebic, Kostic, Ala, Colomwani, William Pacho. There are so many, and they've done an incredible job, and that steered them away from what could have been quite bad financial trouble after COVID, because of course Germany is the whole brand of the Bundesliga really relies on fans. So COVID was as hard on the Bundesliga as it was on any league, and bear in mind that it came back to quite a lot of supporter resistance earlier than the other European leagues. But I think what that tells you is that Eintracht Frankfurt have got a formula that works. They've managed to sell top players and bring in the right ones to replace them. And you can tell that by the way that they've developed them and sold on the replacements for the replacements for the replacements. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason to believe that might stop in the near future. What they have, I think, more than any of the other teams that are competing with Bayern, in fact, more than maybe any other team in the Bundesliga, you could argue they've got the best sporting director in the Bundesliga in Markus Krösche, who has done a brilliant job. Of course, he was at Leipzig before. He was assistant at Bayer Leverkusen when he was still a coach. So he knows the competition intimately, I think, which is quite important as well. And I guess the question is this a summer, Lars, where they could be winners of the transfer market again? Now, as they sold Marmoush halfway through last season, and for me, the most impressive thing about what Eintracht Frankfurt did is they lost their star player. Well, not just any star player. Marmoush was a player who propelled the whole team, who scored the goals, who gave it impetus and momentum. They lost him halfway through the season, and they still managed to make the top 4 in the Bundesliga, and as Dotun says, in third place in the end. I think that's impressive. I guess the question is, what happens with Ugo Ekitike this summer? Because increasing speculation that they'll be entertaining a big offer from Newcastle for him, maybe quite a bit more than Newcastle would ideally like to pay. I would say that's like quite a risky strategy for most clubs, but with Eintracht, you could believe that they could pull something like this off and not fatally weaken themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth, again, as you said, it's worth noting how impressive it is that they ended up finishing third, because they were third after the first half of the season. And then they sell their best player, their talismanic attacker, for an ungodly amount of money in January. And from January onwards, they were also the third best team in the league in the latter half of the season. Also, and so that's Hugo Ekitike stepped up and picked up some of the goal scoring slack, and it just seemed to work. And I've always you hear this term sometimes thrown around as a big negative, like being a selling club is very bad. You have to keep your stars. You can't be a selling club. I think that's not true for almost every club in the world is a selling club. It's not a question of like, often you hold on to your stars and it ends up being a bad idea. You end up not getting the money you could have gotten for them. It's all about like selling at the right time and replacing well. And they've already managed to do without Marmoush because Ekitike stepped up. Now they could sell Ekitike, but they've brought in Jonathan Burkhardt from Mainz, who's coming off a very productive season, scoring 18 goals for Mainz, which is no joke. And he's 24, so he's not like a prospect. He's someone who's already shown he can score goals in the Bundesliga. Really hard-working, hard-running player who should fit into the collective there. So they already have a replacement for at least one striker ready to go. And like you say, they have such a good record of replacing well that you would kind of trust them to get that right. One thing I'd actually put to Andy, since you know the club quite well, do we not give Frankfurt enough credit? Is there a big, because basically we know with Dortmund, they have this reputation for being a great finishing school of talent, which has gone awry a little bit in recent years. Leipzig, we're always talking about the multi-club system and the wonders it produces. And Frankfurt are just kind of there. But as you say, three Champions League qualifications in 3 years now, consistently getting this right in terms of selling guys at the right time and replacing them well. Why are we not? Why are they going under the radar? I realize they're not. They're currently on the radar because we're talking about them, but they go much more under the radar than those other clubs do, I feel.
Yeah, I think they do, and they will for the football supporting community until they hit hard in the Champions League on a consistent basis, like Dortmund were able to do if we go back 10 years, or I suppose even a couple of years, although that's under a different model. So if we're talking about the relentless player development model, we're really talking about Klopp's Dortmund, aren't we? I think the interesting thing to me that suggests that is changing is the fact that you've had James McAtee, who is clearly going to move from Manchester City, captain of the England under-21s this summer, who's, I guess, in that sort of Cole Palmer just before he moves to Chelsea spot, you could argue, where he's someone who believes he could be one of the great English talents but needs somewhere to play consistently and express that. But we hear that he's been over to Eintracht Frankfurt this week and he's been massively impressed. And bear in mind, Joe Bellingham was pretty close to signing there before, in the end, he decided that Dortmund was the one for him. If you've got a McAtee choosing Eintracht Frankfurt ahead of a Dortmund and ahead of clubs in the Premier League that would want to sign him, that is absolutely huge. And that is something that says that they are about to enter a new level. Not necessarily a level, Dotun, in terms of them being able to beat Bayern to the Bundesliga. I think maybe that's a bit early, although, like I said, maybe, depending on the performance of the other clubs who've got their challenges at the moment, as we'll talk about in a minute. I think if they're able to do that, to position themselves as the finishing school for talent in Germany, that Dortmund have drifted a little bit from, and that's why, as David and I were saying a few weeks back, the Joe Bellingham signing is so huge for Dortmund. They need to prove they can still develop talent, not exceptional George Best in front of an open net talent like Haaland and Bellingham. They're not, and Jude Bellingham. They're not representative of anything but their own excellence. They're not representative of a trend or a production line or anything like that. They are exceptional generational talents, and I think the credit that Dortmund can get for developing those players is a little bit limited. But look, if Eintracht are able to do this, not only will this really help them in a sporting sense, obviously, but I think you look at them and you think their financial model, which has done so well for them, could take off even further. I think it's really interesting in a summer when we've talked about how the best strikers are really hard to shift because of PSR, because of FFP. It feels like even the biggest clubs are a little bit reticent to sign sure thing strikers who maybe don't have incredible sell-on value if you're going to keep them for 4 or 5 years, like Gyökeres or Osimhen. Like the market has been quite cold for Osimhen, and that has shocked a lot of people, and that shocked Osimhen and his team. But I think it's really interesting. Like Luke was asking me on the Ramble the other day, Ugo Ekitike, do we think he's really the finished article? Well, he's not, is he? But I mean, he's got so many of the right pieces that suggest he could be, that he'll probably end up costing more than Gyökeres or Osimhen, which is fascinating. And if Eintracht are in this spot where they can sell someone who, if the biggest clubs would rather pay for potential than they would for the sure thing finished article, then that puts Eintracht Frankfurt in an even better spot maybe than they were before.
Well, interesting, actually, because Eintracht Frankfurt have been one of the busiest teams in this transfer window, Lars. But going back to a point that Andy made, is it possible that the opportunity lies there for Eintracht Frankfurt to go to that next stage, to that other level where they are the main competitor in the Bundesliga to Bayern Munich? Is the opportunity there because Dortmund and Leverkusen and Leipzig are in something of a transitionary period themselves?
It's a very polite way of putting it, Dotun. I think... Well, Leverkusen obviously are perceived as vulnerable this summer, of course, because Xabi Alonso has left. So we don't know if they're going to be as good as they've been the last 2 seasons. But I think if we're talking about the story of how Frankfurt finished third and qualified for the Champions League 2 times in 3 seasons and is starting to look like a more and more like credible outsider here, that is as much a story of Dortmund and Leipzig not having their act together and not doing what they're capable of doing. It is, as you know, my favorite saying, you don't have to outswim the shark, you just have to outswim your sister. It is one of, like, it isn't, it's a relative thing. It's a zero-sum game. It's about what the competition are doing. And I think if Leipzig were managing to make that step up from being a developmental club at the top of the multi-club, multi-universe, and actually become a serious competitor, if Dortmund had their act together, I think it would be very difficult for Frankfurt to be competitive just because they have slightly fewer resources. They're increasingly getting more resources by pulling off these great sales. But they are a slightly smaller club, with a slightly smaller cachet. And the story of Frankfurt being so impressive, I think, is also a story of Dortmund and Leipzig being disappointing and not living up to their end of the bargain here.
Andy, I mean, Lars has explained it very clearly, actually, and particularly with, I would argue, Leverkusen, they seem to be in the perhaps, deeper end of the jeopardy, potentially. What's going on with those teams? I mean, Leverkusen have got a hard act to follow in Xabi Alonso, without doubt, but they have employed Erik ten Hag to replace him. Can you see them replicating the success of the last couple of seasons with him?
No, I don't think they can. And I think the fact that it's post-Wirtz, post-Frimpong, there are a number of big changes there at Leverkusen, but I'm not really sure that is the remit for Erik ten Hag, and it shouldn't be. I think Leverkusen, even when they were being wildly successful under Alonso, they were always aware of A, where their natural place in the food chain was, even if they're ambitious to grow, and B, that Alonso was almost on loan to them. They knew he was going to go in the medium term. So I think having Ten Hag, who, if as I said when we were talking about Granit Xhaka on Monday's OTC YouTube video, I think is framing him in a Manchester United context is not helpful, particularly in terms of this job. He's got loads of respect in Germany, and he's a great developer of young players from his time at Ajax. We know that. So I think they are going to go again. I feel that they will get Champions League. Obviously, a lot rests on some of those new signings like Malik Tillman. Can he step up from the PSV level? But I guess Dortmund are a sort of thornier subject. I mean, it's interesting, really, when you think that both Dortmund and Leverkusen in the last little while have gone for more sort of known names, more sort of established coaches in Kovac and Ten Hag, and they're trying to double down on their identity. With Dortmund, I think there's a bigger question over their identity. I don't want to judge anyone how they were at the Club World Cup, but that their performance didn't thrill me. Put it that way. I think Leipzig are even more interesting because they have clearly not reached Europe for the first time since they were promoted to the Bundesliga. New coach, but doubling down on what got them into a good place in the first place. So at the time of recording, they've just signed 4 players in 26 hours, including one, Johan Bakayoko. We've seen enough at PSV to know that he could be like one of the better attacking players in the world, but he's quite a long way off that at the moment. So that's where the development card comes into play. And one at the other end of it, Jan Diomande, who looked terrific for Leganes last season, but is relatively inexperienced at 18. So there's a lot of change at those clubs. And it feels to me, even given the stability at board level at Leverkusen, which I think definitely helps them, Eintracht are in a more solid position. And if they do end up selling Ekitike, it will be on their terms and it will be for their benefit, I think.
Lars, did Joe Bellingham make the right choice? Because he considered Frankfurt as well. He considered Frankfurt and decided to go with the, I suppose, for his family, tried and tested Dortmund route. Did he make the right choice in that respect?
Well, we don't know this. We don't know that now. We can't know that now. But I have to say, Dortmund must still be an incredibly tempting thing. If you're a young player, you're a young, ambitious player, you're going to get a lot of minutes. You're going to play in front of a huge crowd. You're going to feel sort of the pressure of playing for a significant football club. But you also go into a place where they're used to having young players, where they know you don't have to crucify anyone for a bad game here and there. So it just seems it's still very, very tempting, even if they haven't quite gotten that model right the last few years. I do want to mention Leipzig again. I know we're running out of time on the segment, but I feel like we don't talk about this enough. What a disaster their season was, and I think it's one of those things because they're Leipzig, because they're part of the fizzy drink empire, and their cultural imprint on the game is very limited. If they do well, it's kind of interesting. If they don't do well, nobody really cares. But they finished 7th. Which, given they went kind of big in the transfer market last summer, we've had this conversation on the pod with them sort of trying. Okay, we're done with just being a developmental organization. We want to really start challenging. Is what they've been signifying with some of the recent transfers in the last couple of years, and they've completely failed. They were nowhere near it this season. Now Jurgen Klopp has come in as the supreme overlord of things. Maybe that will kickstart a renaissance. But where are we at with Leipzig and Andy? I thought that was a very stinky season from them.
Yeah, and I think it's significant that Jurgen Klopp was there on the first day of training. He said he didn't want to speak because he wanted to give. He didn't want to speak about the team because he wanted to give Ole Werner, the new coach, an opportunity to do that. But him being present there was very important, I think, to show that there's some sort of leadership and show that there's some sort of ambition to recover after last year's poor season. So I think the pressure is not just on the club, it's on Klopp as well.
So fascinating. Clearly the Bundesliga will be one for us to all watch next season. It sounds like it's going to be fascinating.